আচ্ছা, আমাদের কোর্সের নাম হচ্ছে ডেটা স্ট্রাকচার, ঠিক না? ডেটা স্ট্রাকচার কি জিনিস? কন্টেইনার্স টু স্টোর ডেটা। আমরা অলরেডি কিছু ডেটা স্ট্রাকচারস আমরা প্রিভিয়াস কোর্স থেকে শিখে এসেছি। ফর এক্সাম্পল, the simplest of all is a variable, and of course a list or arrays. If you've done Python, then you are familiar with list. If you did Java or C, you must be familiar with arrays. Okay, arrays and lists are different. Okay? Arrays are of fixed length. Fixed length means if you create an array of, for example, size 4, length 4, you cannot, and in case there's a fifth element, there is no way you can add that element into this array. But in this case, what you have to do is you have to resize. And resizing is a bit complex, you'll see in the future. On the other hand, lists are of dynamic length. This means I can add as many elements I want. The data structure doesn't have a fixed length. But in an array, you have random access. That is, you can access using index number. But in lists, there is no index number. But if you have done Python, although you call it a list, but there is an index number, right? The data structure used in
Yes,
Python
sir.
is a bit advanced than list. This is more like an array list. Although we call it a list, but the data structure used in Python is an array list, which means you can add as many elements you want, plus you'll have random access. I mean, you can access any element using the index number. So this is a basic difference of arrays and lists. In the future, we'll spend a lot of time use a lot of time on lists, how they're created, what lists are, how they work, and so on. And I think I don't have to explain much about arrays, right? We've done a lot in CC1 and triple one. The first topic for today is right and left shift. If we have an array of, for example, 4 numbers, and we do a right shift on this array, this means all the elements will move one space to the right. This is right, and all the elements will move one space. That is, 4 will move one space to the right, 3 will move one space to the right, which means 4 gets replaced by 3. Similarly, 2 moves one space to the right, and 3 gets replaced by 2. 1 replaces 2, and if you look, when 4 was shifted on the right, 4 gets lost. We lose the number, we lose a value, okay? After we shift, we have this. And if you see, there is a duplication, a duplicate, right? Duplicate numbers. Over here, we have to replace the duplicate number with a zero. So shifting means we shift the elements one space to the right, and as a result, one space gets empty, and that empty space is denoted by zero. And the last element, we lose the last element. Similarly, if we do a left shift, in left shift, all the elements move left one space. If we call left shift on the same array, all the elements move one space to the left. That is, 1 gets replaced by 2, 2 gets replaced by 3, 3 gets replaced by 4. And we delete 4 and replace it using a 0. 0 denotes an empty space. And we lose this value 1. Understood?
তাহলে কি স্যার ওয়ানটা রিমুভ হয়ে যাবে?
হ্যাঁ, remove হয়ে যাবে, right?
ওকে স্যার।
Okay. So let's look a bit into coding. While you code, it's what should I say? It's wise to always draw the scenario, okay? Always draw. If you draw the scenario, you can code by looking at the picture. You don't have to memorize anything. You're given an array and you're asked to do a right shift. First draw. Do not rush into code. First draw what and see what happens. If I take a variable, I know that right shift, in right shift all the elements move one space to the right. So what I have to do is if I take a variable, let's call it I, and what I do is I shift the element I minus 1th element to I, my job is done. So what I do is I start I from the last index, which is, let's say this is A. We point I to the last index and then we do this. The element pointed by I gets replaced by the element in the previous index, right? And this thing continues for every element, and which means I have to use a loop. So I was initially length minus 1, which is the last index. And then we run a loop. We check the condition that if I is greater than 0, then we replace the element pointed by I by the element pointed by I minus 1. This means 4 gets replaced by 3. And then I is decremented. This loop continues. Here I gets replaced by the value pointed by I gets replaced by the value pointed by I minus 1, which means 3 gets replaced by 2. Then we decrement I again. I is still greater than 0, therefore 2 gets replaced by 1. Decrement I. I is no longer greater than 0. My loop breaks. When my loop breaks, my array looks like this. I have to make this 0. What I do is, outside the loop, I write an extra line, a0 is equal to 0, or ai is equal to 0 because I points to 0. Questions? And if you do not have questions, look at left shift. The left shift is similar to right shift except for the fact that the elements move one space to the left. Do the same thing. First draw the scenario. This is left. My elements will move to the left. Therefore, I take a variable I, and I this time points at 0. I run a loop where I will continue progressing until it reaches the last index, which is length a minus 1, length of the array minus 1. And then what I have to do is I have to replace the element pointed by I by the element pointed by I plus 1. So I can write this. Once I replace the number or the value, I increment I. And this continues until I reaches the last index. When I reaches the last index, the resultant array would look like this. Then I have to make this particular value 0. What I do is simply write ai is equal to 0 because I points to the last index. So this is basically what shifting means. Now let's move on to the next topic for the day. Right and left rotate. Shifting and rotate are 90% similar, or you can say 95% similar, except for the fact that while rotating an array, the element, no value gets lost, no value is removed. For example, if I do a right rotate and move the elements one space to the right, but while shifting we completely deleted this element, but while rotating I will bring this element back to this index, right? We rotate. In case of a left rotate, all the elements move one space to the left, and the first element comes back at the very last index. So over here, no elements are being removed, no empty spaces created. Now, if we go back to this particular slide, how can we edit the shifting code to make it a rotate code? Any guesses? What we have to do is, before we start replacing the numbers, I have to use a temporary variable and save that number which is getting removed during shift. Therefore, in right shift, the last number was getting removed. Therefore, before I start replacing the numbers, I Before the loop starts, I take a temporary variable and I save this particular number. And then when all the shifting is done, when all the replacing is done, at the very end, instead of replacing index number 0 with a 0, I replace index number 0 with x. And I do the same thing for left rotate, just two lines. Instead of a 0, just write x. So this is the difference. I mean, two lines. Very basic difference between shift and rotate. In shift, we remove an element, and while rotating, no elements get removed. The last element or the first element during right shift or the left shift comes back. Okay, as I showed you in the picture. So this is basically what the first lecture is. We're not going to look into any new data structure today. This is basically some, you know, playing with the arrays. From the next week, we'll look into new data structures. And before we meet next week, I want you guys to do something. First, a few things you need to do this weekend. First, you go to Box and go through all the lectures of Shift and Rotate, which is basically week 1. The second thing is go to Box and look at the lecture dealing with circular array. Now, I don't expect you to understand 100% about what circular array is, but when you go look at it, you know, it gets easier when we discuss. You know, when we will discuss next week. And the third thing you must do is, if you think you lack knowledge on objects and classes, if you think you're not sure what objects and classes are, how they work, or you think you lack knowledge about objects and classes, please make sure you know very well what objects and classes are. Okay? In 220, 80% of the course deals with objects and classes. So if you're not sure, if you don't know what objects and classes are and how they work, you're not gonna make through this course, okay? Your STs will be assigned next week, I hope. So talk to your STs, read books, go through previous course lectures, and make sure you understand what objects and classes are. So this is basically what today's lecture is about. Nothing new. We haven't looked at any new data structure, but from next week things gonna get a bit challenging and interesting. So see you next week. Before that, are there any questions? Okay.
স্যার আমাদের কি মানে জাভা এন্ড পাইথন দুইটা ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজে জানা থাকতে হবে?
Now you can use either Java or Python, but I suggest you learn both the languages.
ইয়েস স্যার, কিন্তু স্যার আমাদের সিএসসি 110 আর 111 তো আমি মানে পাইথন শিখে এসেছি, এই জন্য ভাবলাম
হ্যাঁ,
এটা
আচ্ছা
কি
তাহলে পাইথনই করো, বাট জাভাও শেখার চেষ্টা করো। It's very good if you know two languages. It's
ইয়েস
gonna
স্যার, ইয়েস
help in
স্যার,
the future.
ইয়েস স্যার, থ্যাংক ইউ।
Any other questions? If there are no questions, then this is it for today. We meet next week, inshallah. Okay, goodbye.
আল্লাহ হাফেজ স্যার।
Allah
স্যার
Hafiz.
স্যার
হ্যাঁ,
স্যার আমাদের মানডেতে কয়টা থেকে ক্লাস হবে স্যার?
একই সময়।
সোমবার। আচ্ছা। আর হচ্ছে স্যার ইউএসএ